Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. Today we will discuss an anti-Semitic incident that happened to a tenured college professor. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a daughter of Holocaust survivors, and in 2006, I emigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller. I'm the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, Thin Edge of the Wedge. I grew up in the small Midwestern town of Elgin outside Chicago. It was not a Holocaust community. Our parents and grandparents had come to America at the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar and other pogroms, except in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever.
Our guest today is Daniel Pollack-Pelzner. He was previously a tenured professor of English at the private Portland, Oregon Linfield University, affiliated with American Baptist churches. He's now a visiting scholar at Portland State University, and for 10 years has been the scholar in residence for the Portland Shakespeare Project. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. We're thrilled to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we could say that we wish we weren't having this interview because the incidents didn't happen. But since they did happen, we want to talk about it with our audience. So can you tell us about the anti-Semitic remarks made by Linfield University's president, Miles K. Davis? Also, when these were made and in what context these were made?
Sure. So they started off in just a kind of ordinary interaction. So I'd been an English professor for about a decade at this small school just outside of Portland. And we had a new president coming in, President Davis, and I wanted to welcome him to the university and learn about ways that I might support his vision and get to collaborate with him. And so I had scheduled a meeting with him early on in his time at Linfield. And he was very solicitous to get to know faculty as well and asked what I was teaching. And I was doing a Shakespeare class that term, which we talked about in one of our early meetings. And I mentioned my experience teaching Shakespeare's play Merchant of Venice as a Jewish professor and my shifting relationship with the play. I have one grandparent who thought it should never be performed, another grandparent who took me to see it for my first Shakespeare show, and shifting notions of anti-Semitism that we explored in the play. And the president said to me, he was eager to contribute what he knew about this topic, and told me that he knew that if you measured the size of an average Jewish nose and compared it to the size of the average Arab nose, that you couldn't tell the difference between them. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I think he's sharing this out of a good faith desire to be part of this conversation. But honestly, I didn't think that anybody talked about measuring the size of Jewish noses after about 1945 or so. And I was very surprised that the person who was now going to be in charge of the university thought that that was a kind of reasonable path of inquiry. But I wanted to get along with him. I didn't want to make the conversation awkward. So I think I just sort of smiled and filed it away in the back of my head. Then those were in the positive early days of our relationship. Then about a year later, I guess, I had been at Linfield for a while, as you mentioned. I had been tenured. I was very fortunate to be given an endowed chair in Shakespeare studies to do my work. And there was a position at Linfield University on the board of trustees that was a position for a faculty member to have a 2-year term on the board to try to improve communication and relations between the faculty and the people who were charged with governing the institution. And against my will and better judgment, I was nominated to this post. I declined it a few times, but they couldn't find anybody else to do it. So I was elected to be the faculty trustee. And after my very first meeting on the board, which was in November 2019, colleagues, other professors started coming to me to say that they and their students had been sexually harassed by senior members of the board, also including the president. They were sharing these allegations of sexual harassment with me, and they asked if in my capacity as a trustee on the board, I could advocate for better training for trustees about what appropriate ways to engage with faculty and students would be and what inappropriate ways would be, and guidelines for proper conduct. And naively, as I said, of course, I couldn't imagine that anybody wouldn't want to have better training and better guidelines in place. And I think I must have gone through 10 emails or so with the president of the university and the chair of the board requesting that we get these in place before our next meeting, because then it came out that there actually had been other reports of sexual harassment by other members of the board. So it turned out there had been allegations of misconduct at the previous 3 meetings of the board, all of which included social events with trustees and faculty and students.
Okay.
Some of which involving alcohol, some of which off campus, that also had a good intention to try to improve communication, but at least students and faculty felt that improper behavior was occurring there. So I thought in good conscience, I can't continue to advertise these events and encourage students and colleagues to attend them if there's not some better policies and training put in place. And we hadn't reached progress on that when the invitation came out for a next round of a Board of Trustee event with faculty were asked to host dinners for trustees with alcohol at their homes on Valentine's Day. Actually was the day when it was occurring in 2020. And so at that point, I wrote to the board and said, I'd love to be able to support these events and I want to be able to have good communications, but I've said multiple times, we really need to address these concerns from past events. And until we get some training and some guidelines in place, I can't, I don't feel like I can in good conscience encourage people to attend, but leave it up to other people's discretion. So the chair of the board at that point called me into his office. He was a partner at a big law firm in Portland and accused me of having a secret agenda. He said I wasn't really concerned about the issues that I was representing. He said I had a secret agenda to grab power and that I was trying to put kids at risk, and the real threat were faculty preying on students, not the trustees. And that surprised me as well, because I thought it was so odd that somebody would see this request that I thought was just intuitive through this kind of lens. And the chair said other weird things, that he wasn't going to ask the trustees to become Puritans, and he wasn't going to put on a hair shirt just because my friends didn't like being touched. And it was a very weird meeting, but I tried to focus on getting these policies in place, but it still wasn't happening. And so I wrote my report to the board, which was the faculty trustee's job before each meeting, describing what had been told to me by colleagues and students and why I really thought it was important to address it promptly and intentionally. And the president at that point called me into his office, this is now February 2020, and said that I would be destroying Linfield if I sent out this report, which I also thought was a strong thing to say. I thought I was trying to help the school be stronger and trying to do my duty for the university. And as it happened, at the same time, there were also instances of racist graffiti on campus in the student dorms. There was anti-Black hate speech involving the N-word. It was my understanding as it was reported to me, and also swastikas that were present on whiteboards. And along with some other faculty, I wrote a letter saying that we really students felt that those events hadn't been taken seriously, and they were coming to my office saying, how come nobody's talking about this? Why aren't they being addressed? So I authored a letter with other colleagues saying, we really take these issues seriously, along with the reports of sexual harassment. We would like there to be better training. We would like to participate in it. We'd like to have this addressed. And on the day that the president told me that I'd be destroying Linfield if I issued this report, he came to a faculty meeting and said he didn't understand why people like me who'd written this letter were so concerned about this graffiti on campus. And professor is a Black man. He has lived experience that's far different from my own. So I deferred to him on how he was processing the anti-Black hate speech. But I thought it was odd that he would say that a Jewish professor shouldn't be concerned about the presence of swastikas on campus, or imply that in his remarks. But I'm still sort of filing this all away. And then that weekend was the official meeting of the Board of Trustees, and the president gave his remarks to the full board. And usually the president's remarks are on the order of, the football team has won this number of games, we've raised this amount of money for the science building. But on this occasion, I did go ahead and send my report as written to the board. The president had withheld it from the faculty, withheld it from the board, and then issued it with his rebuttal. And the president got up in front of the entire board and gave his entire remarks to saying that he was a student of history, and he knew that great empires of old had been destroyed by internal disloyalty and dissent from within, and that the Mongol Empire had been brought down by internal disunion, and the Ottoman Empire had been brought down by this internal discord. And now Linfield was being threatened by the same thing, unless we all, he said that the climax of his speech was, unless we all followed the teachings of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount. And I think too, at the time, I just thought, well, this is such an odd use of the speech, odd way of viewing history. People on the board, I think, were kind of nodding along, because the board, sort of unlike the rest of the school, was still had a real tone that was set by very lovely Baptist ministers who would begin meetings with prayers. And so the idea that we would all be better off following the gospel according to Matthew was not a radical thing to say. But as I thought about it more, and as I described what I had experienced to other friends who had studied Jewish history, and professors of Jewish history, helped me to see this kind of what had become at that point a pattern of not taking concerns about anti-Semitic remarks seriously, and then conversely seeing a lone visible Jewish member of the board who was raising concerns as engaging in a kind of secret power grab and threatening to bring down the university because of a lack of loyalty and a secret agenda. And that's when I decided I needed to do something about it.
Right. Whoa. That's quite a remarkable story you're telling us here, Daniel. And that was the president who made the remarks about the empires going down because of internal disloyalty, which is often something that's an allegation towards Jews, that they have dual loyalty. What was this, the president of the board or the president of the university?
Those remarks about these historical instances of destruction from within was the president of the university, and the remarks about me having a secret agenda to grab power were the chair of the board. And then I later learned from other colleagues at Linfield that the president of the university, in discussing hiring and firing procedures, according to them, had said that had made a kind of offhanded remark about how he liked to fire people. And he said, you don't give Jews soap on the way to the showers. And that's not a remark I witnessed personally, but that's a remark that other colleagues witnessed and reported. And the president later said was a kind of truism that he had heard in his training and was passing along.
That is unbelievable.
I don't even understand it, but okay,
you don't give Jews soap on their way to the gas chambers. That's what he said.
I know.
Right.
And the words. let's.
Yeah.
I think it had to do with sort of not sugarcoating people's termination.
Right. So, as the university president is a member of a minority group himself, did this factor into your decision of what you decided to do?
Well, absolutely something that was on my mind. And I think the president was put in an extremely difficult position by the board. So the president of any university that's governed by a board serves at the pleasure of the board. Board had hired the president in a very difficult time. The president was a lone African-American leader at Linfield University, in a state that has a history of racial exclusion and systemic racism. He was a faith-based leader at a university whose sort of academic environment was largely secular. He was from a military background in an environment that had few military people presence. He was coming from Virginia, I believe, to the Pacific Northwest. So there were lots of ways in which the president was coming from culture and lived experience that were different than the majority culture at Linfield. And I think there was, as a result, a lot of empathy for his position, desire to reach out and to be welcoming and to recognize that that we would need to adjust to him, couldn't expect him to kind of assimilate to Linfield norms. But the board made him their spokesperson for a history of allegations of sexual misconduct that predated his tenure, and I think put him in a very difficult position. And then, I also came to think, like, this is kind of how systemic racism works. There were 4 different members of the board who had been accused of behaving inappropriately by students and by faculty over the last several years. Two were older white men, 2 were African-American men, including the president. And as far as I know, the board only had investigations done of the 2 African-American men and not the 2 older white men. And so I do think, although I don't agree with the way that the president behaved, I do think he was a kind of victim of an old boys network, as others of us were.
Well, was the chair, I'm just curious, was the chair who called you into his law office, was he one of the 2 older white men?
He was an older white man. He had not been accused of sexual
that's what I
harassment, but 2 of his good friends were.
Okay, so let's move. Can we move on to what happened next? You went public. So how did that decision happen, and what did you do?
Well, I didn't go public at first. I spent about a year trying to have these issues addressed internally. I first went to, my understanding of what you were supposed to do if you had concerns about religious harassment was to go to the director of HR and the Title IX officer, as well as the chair of the board. So I did that. I remember thinking, like, oh, I guess I know how this is going to go, when I talked to our HR director and described what I had been told to her. And she was a very, very nice lady. And she said to me, she listened very patiently. And then she said, Daniel, I just want you to know, I don't think Jews have a secret agenda to grab power at all, because I have a neighbor who's Jewish and is the nicest person, and I don't think they would try to grab power. And I thought, wow, this is a well-intentioned person, but who evidently thinks the question of whether or not Jews have a secret agenda to grab power is a live enough one that she needs to summon an anecdotal experience to disprove it. So I wasn't optimistic. There was an investigation done internally. The president denied making all the comments that I've related to you, and then the chair of the board was not investigated, following this pattern of not investigating the senior white members of the board. The president has since admitted making the remarks that I've heard, and the chairman of the board has since admitted making the remarks that I've heard, but the board used the sort of inconclusiveness of the investigation as evidence that there was no wrongdoing, and substantiated the allegations that, in one case, a colleague of mine had made about being harassed, but said it didn't violate any Linfield policies for her to be grabbed on the thigh and back and propositioned by a senior member of the board who wanted her to go off campus with him and hang out when her own tenure case was about to be voted on by him. So the results of the internal investigations were not satisfying, and the board also declined to investigate a student's complaint about a senior trustee who went up to her, squeezed her, told her she was beautiful, and winked at her. But this was sort of simmering in the background. But then the board decided, did 2 things. It censored my report and prevented the board from discussing it, or for me from discussing it with the board. And then it announced it was going to get rid of the faculty trustee position, and a student, the previous student trustee, had also reported sexual harassment by members of the board, and the board announced it was going to get rid of the student trustee position as well. And at the same time, the news came out from a student more broadly about these prior instances of harassment, and that actually the chair of the board had known that there were previous allegations against another senior trustee, but had kept him on the board, had promised to keep this other trustee away from students and alcohol, and hadn't. So there were big student protests. The faculty took a vote of no confidence in the chair of the board, and the board decided it was going to disregard that faculty vote. Students wrote dozens and dozens of letters to the chair of the board and the president expressing their concern and their lack of faith in this leadership. The board ignored them. And there was a lot of effort to try to keep lines of communication open, to try to keep those trustee positions, just so that the board would be in communication with somebody who had the experience of being on the ground. And then it was when I finally learned, this was in the spring of 2021, I guess, I finally learned that the board had moved ahead to get rid of the faculty trustee position. Then I felt I've been trying for a year to make these changes happen internally. Not only are they not happening, but the board is making the decision to cut off communication on these issues with the faculty, that I felt I had exhausted the internal options for change, and that I needed to share them publicly, just to have a record established of what had happened at Linfield.
And so what did you do?
I posted a Twitter thread at the end of March 2021, describing what I had experienced directly, and I didn't share anything, confidential, only things that I had experienced firsthand and that people had told me directly and had been reported in the papers. And I hoped, I basically felt at that point like we tried internally to ask the board to do the right thing, to, when they didn't on their own, to pressure them to do so, and they just made it clear they weren't going to be accountable to anybody else at Linfield except for themselves. And so I hoped that somebody else is sort of like tossing a message in a bottle and throwing it out in the hopes that somebody else would find it. And people did. And so I heard almost immediately from the Anti-Defamation League that was very concerned about what was happening. I heard from Oregon legislators, the Oregon State Assembly, who were very concerned, wanted to know what they could do to help, community members as well. And the Oregon Board of Rabbis reached out, and they both the Oregon, well, I believe what happened first, the Anti-Defamation League wrote a letter of concern, and then the president responded publicly to them saying that I was conducting a smear campaign to try to bring down Linfield. And my memory is the ADL responded then by calling for the president and the chair of the board's resignation. And the Oregon Board of Rabbis also called for the president and the chair of the board's resignation. A member of the board responded to the Oregon Board of Rabbis by saying that I was a pathological liar who was trying to use my Jewish affiliation to advance my own agenda. And I remember saying to the board at that point, like, haven't we learned something about accusing Jews of having secret agendas to advance their power? But there was no traction. The faculty passed another vote of no confidence in the chair of the board and president of the university, calling for their resignation, and the board disregarded that. Sorry, this recount is causing my puppy to bark in solidarity in the background. And then I kept at each phase thinking, well, surely the board's just going to recognize, like, people of conscience looking at this situation think it's intolerable, but it actually only escalated from there.
And so you were fired at what point, right?
Yeah, as these letters and pressures were coming in, I got a notice from the provost saying that I was being summoned to a meeting the next day to discuss my employment with the head of HR. And I didn't know what that meant. I hadn't received any concerns ever with my performance as a faculty member. I'd had many performance reviews, which should not raise any concern. The school would give me awards for my teaching and my scholarship. And in fact, I thought that I felt like I had a lot of privilege at the institution, being a person with tenure and with a chair and a white man who tended to be listened to by virtue of my position. So I thought it was sort of incumbent upon me to speak out on these issues, also because I was a trustee and I had my duty to. So I felt like I was fairly protected in doing so. But I was being summoned to this meeting for my employment. I asked if I needed a lawyer. They said, the provost said she couldn't tell me what it was about.
What date? Tell us when this was.
This was at the end of April in 2021. It was a
Okay.
Monday evening. And I said, well, if you can't tell me whether I need a lawyer, then I think I probably do need a lawyer. I don't have one. So could we hold off a day or two until I could get one? And she told me then the meeting was not going to take place. And I remember on this Tuesday afternoon, I was on a Zoom call. I decided I'm going to keep doing my job. It was the pandemic, so we were working remotely a lot. I was on a Zoom call with the head of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival as I was writing an article for The Atlantic about race in American theater. And so on my work-issued laptop in my dining room, and all of a sudden the Zoom shut down. And I thought, oh no, the internet's gone out at my house. And then my laptop shut down too. And it restarted, and I tried to log in, and it said, you don't have access to your laptop. And all I was thinking at the time was, oh no, this head of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival must think I've hung up on her. I've got to find a way to reconnect with her. And I tried logging, so I couldn't log in. And so I tried just emailing my work account from my Gmail account, and I got an auto reply back saying Daniel Pollack-Pelzner is no longer an employee of Linfield University.
Wow.
And that's how I knew then that I had been fired.
This is a terrible series of events. I'm very sorry that all this happened to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Evelyn. And it was, I guess the other surprise, besides the fact that I thought I had some institutional security, was that there's a really clear and established process for how you terminate tenured faculty members, and you can do it if they're not doing their professional duties, but it has to be for cause, and it has to be cause related to job performance. You're not teaching well, you're not doing your professional work, and you have to have a hearing, and you have to present evidence, and you have to give the person a chance to reply. And Linfield just ignored all that and pulled the plug.
And they didn't give you cause, right? I mean, after the fact. I mean, there was a lawsuit. I'm kind of skipping ahead. Did they ever give you cause?
Yes, they said that the reason was that they felt I was making untrue statements and that I was harming the university and that I was violating attorney-client privilege in my public statements.
But you won the lawsuit eventually, right?
Yeah, so we sued them for wrongful termination. You're not allowed under Oregon law to terminate people for making good faith complaints about workplace security. And Linfield countersued me, claimed yet again that I was destroying the university, that I was using my vast media network to try to bring down the school and advance my own agenda. But after the American Association of University Professors, which is the professional organization in my field, investigated and found that Linfield had totally violated its own policies and standards of behavior, and officially censured Linfield and put it on its list of censured institutions, then Linfield said they wanted to discuss settling the case, and ultimately they agreed to the terms that we had set.
But the president is still there, is that correct?
That's my understanding, yeah.
What about the chair, the person who was chair of the trustees at the time?
He's resigned as chair, but he's still on the board.
And what can we learn from this? I mean, I have to say, you have our admiration. I'm sure I can speak for Evelyn, that you spoke up. I mean, I'm like almost emotional about this. I am sure that many people wouldn't, in your position, especially Jews. And you know, we live in this world in which we know that we can always be attacked for being Jewish, even if it has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So we really admire. And in retrospect, how can you help others? Was there something you should have done sooner? Not should have, but I mean, give us your lessons as we come to near the end of the show. What can we learn going forward?
Well, I I guess I have kind of two takeaways. One is that power and oppression, I feel like I learned belatedly operate in, I guess, what we now call intersectional ways. So I had approached these issues thinking that this was about gender and harassment, and I was completely surprised that suddenly my religion was and my ethnicity were an issue in this work. And I probably shouldn't have been, but I was also surprised that race played an issue in how these things were playing out too. And I sort of I hope going forward that we can think about ways in which Jews are in allyship and should be in allyship with people who are experiencing oppression along lots of different axes, and can try to work in solidarity to challenge people who are abusing their power. And the other thing for me, I feel like I learned is even though the president is still there, he serves at the pleasure of the board. The board has made it clear that their priorities are not addressing these issues in the way that I thought they should. But that when I did speak up, there were thousands of people around the country and around the world who spoke up with me, including Linfield students and alumni, and including organizations like the ADL and the Oregon Board of Rabbis, and the American Association of University Professors, and colleagues who signed letters of support and sent letters of support around the world. So I think it can feel, at least I felt, very isolated individually when I'm the lone faculty member on the board saying, hey, we got a problem. And these other people are looking at me like I'm telling them that aliens have landed on the campus and that I'm going crazy. But that speaking up publicly was a way to garner, I think, draw more attention to the issue. And the provost is no longer there. The dean of faculty is no longer there. The dean of students is no longer there. The head of HR, I believe, is resigning. The chairman of the board has changed. So institutional change happens slowly, but I do hope at least that outpouring of support was played some role, and I hope also let students know that when they raise concerns, even if the people in direct positions of power weren't responding the way that they wanted, that there were people elsewhere who would advocate for them, and that these are values that are worth standing up for, whether or not they reach immediate change at Linfield, that we can continue to advocate for in other places of study and work as well. And I was very fortunate in my own case that Portland State University actually stepped in and said, we believe in what you did, and we would like to have you here, not despite of your speech, but because of it. And that a donor who had endowed my chair at Linfield wanted to continue supporting my work as well. And that I feel like I've come away feeling very, very supported and very actually affirmed in these values in the broader community, even if not at Linfield in particular.
Well, that's great to hear. So you got support from the wider Jewish community locally. You got, and not only locally, also ADL. You got support from certain colleagues of yours
Mm-hmm.
who were probably not members of the Jewish community. That's great to hear. But you said something else. You said, I thought we were speaking up these days in an intersectional alliance,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was not the case, if I understand you well.
Oh,
You didn't get that automatic support from other minority groups. Is that correct? As a Jew?
no, if that's what I communicated, then I feel like I've misspoken.
Okay.
I've certainly got lots of support from colleagues of color, from women who are doing advocacy work around gender too. No, I did absolutely feel that. I thought that was an important aspect of how I came to understand the situation at Linfield, that when there's power consolidated in a few older white men's hands, that's bad for lots of different people. And that in speaking up, I had lots of allies. And that, I mean, I suppose this is for me another lesson, is that I was sort of thrust into this position and doing a lot of catch-up work. There are so many colleagues around the world who have been doing advocacy work like this around sexual harassment, around anti-Semitism, around academic freedom for long before I was born, and so I've been grateful to learn from colleagues at the ACLU, at institutions of academic freedom, of anti-oppression organizations, and support from my rabbis in town and friends elsewhere. So I feel like there are lots of people from many backgrounds who are absolutely thinking about these issues intersectionally, from whom I've been grateful to learn, and from whom I feel like I can draw on in the future.
That's great to hear. Yeah.
As we end this in a minute or so, we're going to give you last thoughts, but I do hope that our listeners will take encouragement from what you did and be encouraged in their own, I hate to use the word battles, but in their own battles. So do you have any last couple of words before we thank you and end the program?
You know, I'm looking right now just above my computer screen at a poster that that students and colleagues made for me, and those keep calm and carry on posters that there have been lots of riffs on from the British experience in World War II. And when the provost announced my termination, the email was called an extraordinary step they recognized was an unusual thing to do. And students took that phrase back, and they made this poster that says, keep calm and take extraordinary steps. And the extraordinary steps they wanted to take were about, being an upstander. And I'm just looking at this poster, and it's filled with signatures and messages from students who do not seem cowed at all by the administration, even when the administration hosed down student chalk messages and threatened to fine students for putting up their messages and not allowing posters to be put up and taking down posters. None of that actually ended up deterring students who wanted to speak out, that students recognized that they had strength in solidarity and in numbers and in social media savvy. And so that really gives me hope moving forward, is that our students and my children's generation knows what values they want to be advocating for. And even if it takes the rest of us a little bit longer to catch up with them, that they're going to continue showing the way forward for us.
Thank you. Thank you. That is just such an inspiring conclusion. Really, I'm going to try not to cry. So thank you for coming on the show and sharing with us. Thank you, our listeners. For those of you who have not yet seen Evelyn being an upstander in her documentary, Never Again Is Now, you can see it on YouTube and Amazon. You can read nonfiction accounts of survivors and saviors in my play, thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we end every podcast, we say, please, without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.